It started with a distress beacon. We were 3 weeks out from the castle relay, hauling refined ore through the dead quiet of the outer reach when our long-range picked up a signal. Old human encoding. Real old pre-diaspora, the kind of carrier wave they hadn't used since before any of us were born. Our captain, a hard woman named Vask who'd flown freight for 40 years, almost didn't stop for it. Stopping costs fuel, costs time, costs money we didn't have. But it was a human beacon, out there in the black where no human ship had any business being, and Vask had a rule. You don't leave your own kind in the dark. So we burned 3 days of margin to go look. What we found wasn't a ship. It was a graveyard. A debris field the size of a small moon, spread thin across 100,000 kilometers of nothing, and every piece of it was human-made. Old hull plating, burst fuel cells, the blackened ribs of ships built in a style none of us recognized, a style that belonged in a museum. We drifted through it with the running lights low, and nobody on the bridge said a word because it felt like walking through a cemetery in the dark. I was up there because I'd come to bring Vask coffee. I never left. I stood at the back of the bridge and watched the wreckage slide past the viewport, and I felt the hair go up on my arms because some of those hull fragments still had markings on them. Faded, burned, but readable. Earth, not Terra, not the diplomatic name the galaxy used for us now. Earth. The old word, the home word, on ships that had died out here in the dark longer ago than anyone could account for. Vask, our navigator said, and his voice came out strange. These ships, the wear pattern, the radiation aging, I'm reading this debris at 400 years old, minimum. 400 years. Humanity hadn't even had deep space capability 400 years ago, not according to anything in the records, not according to anything we'd ever been taught. We joined the wider galaxy barely 90 years back, a young species, a latecomer, taken in by the great old powers and given a small seat at a long table. So what were 400-year-old human warships doing dead in the outer reach, in a part of space no human had any record of ever reaching? That was the question that killed 11 of us, though we didn't know it yet. We should have left. I think about that a lot. We should have logged the coordinates, said a quiet word for the dead, and burned for home. But Vask wanted answers, and so did I, and so did all of us, because there's a hunger that gets into you when you find a piece of your own history that you didn't know was missing. We found the source of the beacon near the center of the field. A ship, mostly intact, the only one hanging dead in the dark with a single emergency light still pulsing on its hull after 4 centuries, running on some power cell that should have died 300 years ago but hadn't. Human engineering. We always did build things to last past all reason. Vask sent a boarding party. 6 people. I was one of them because if anyone was alive in there after 400 years, impossible, but you check, they'd need a medic. The inside of that ship was the coldest place I've ever been. Not temperature, something else. We moved through corridors in our suit lights, past consoles gone dark, past sealed doors, and everywhere there was this feeling of a thing interrupted. Meals half finished, calcified to dust. A child's toy floating in a rec room. Personal effects drifting in the zero-G like the people had stepped out for a moment and just never come back. We found them in the cryo bay. Hundreds of pods, all of them dark. All of them failed long ago, the people inside them gone to nothing but shadows and salt. All of them except one. The pod at the end of the row had a light on it. Green. Active. 400 years and one pod was still holding, still cycling, still keeping something alive inside it. The readout was in old Earth script, and it took me a minute to parse it, and when I did my blood went cold. The occupant was alive. Vitals low, but alive, and the pod's log showed it had been opened and resealed exactly once in 400 years, 80 years ago. Someone had woken up, looked around at the graveyard and gone back under, chosen to keep sleeping rather than face whatever was out here alone. Vask made the call. We brought the pod back to the freighter. And that decision, bringing one sleeping human home out of a 400-year-old graveyard. That was the thread that, when we pulled it, unraveled everything the galaxy thought it knew about us. His name was Thomas Vey. We thought him slow over 2 days the way the old medical text said you had to. I sat with him the whole time, and when he finally opened his eyes, gray eyes, ancient and clear, the first thing he did was look at me, at my face, at the modern cut of my medic's jacket, and he started to cry. Quietly, without making a sound. "You're still here," he whispered. "I didn't think there'd be any of us left." I didn't understand what he meant. I told him he was safe. I told him he was aboard a human freighter, that humanity was thriving, that we had a seat on the sevenfold council and colonies on 40 worlds, and that whatever had happened to his fleet, we'd survived it, we'd come back stronger. And Thomas Vey looked at me with those ancient gray eyes and said something that I have never been able to forget. "Survived it," he said. "Renner, you don't know, do you? None of you know what happened. They told you a different story." He gripped my arm with a strength that shouldn't have been in a man 400 years asleep. "What do they teach you about how humanity joined the galaxy? Tell me the story they tell you." So I told him the story everyone knows. How humanity, 90 years ago, developed jump technology and reached out into the dark, frightened and alone, and how the great old powers of the Sevenfold Council found us, took pity on our isolation and welcomed us in. The benevolent galaxy, lifting up the lonely young species. The story they teach children. The story on the monuments. Thomas Vey listened to all of it, and by the end he was shaking his head, and there was something in his face that wasn't grief anymore. It was rage. 400-year-old rage, kept on ice, perfectly preserved. "That's not what happened," he said. "Renner, that's not even close to what happened. We didn't reach out to them frightened and alone." His grip tightened. "We were already out here, 500 years ago. We were a starfaring people. We had 100 worlds. We had a real fleet. And the galaxy you call benevolent looked at us spreading into the dark, and they got afraid, and they decided to end us before we got any bigger." The bay was very quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat. "They didn't welcome us," Thomas Vey said. "They invaded Earth. They burned our colonies, they shattered our fleet, they bombed us back to a single planet and a Stone Age memory, and then they waited a few hundred years and discovered the frightened primitives they'd made of us, and they wrote themselves into the role of saviors. The whole story is a lie built on a mass grave." His eyes found mine. "And I can prove it. That's why I'm still alive. That's why I went back to sleep 80 years ago instead of dying out here. I was waiting for a ship, for a human ship to find me so I could finally tell someone the truth." I didn't believe him. Not at first. You don't overturn everything you've ever been taught because a half-frozen man tells you a story. But then he told me what was in the sealed vault at the heart of his ship, and I went back and I opened it. And after that, I believed every word. I'm not going to tell you everything that was in that vault. Some of it I still can't talk about. But the core of it was simple, and it was devastating, and it was undeniable. It was records, sensor logs, ship-to-ship communications. The complete operational archive of a human defense fleet from 500 years ago, and stamped through all of it, clear as day, were the identifications of the ships that attacked them. Council ships, the fleets of the great old powers, the same powers that sat on the Sevenfold Council today, that had welcomed us, that humanity now thanked in ceremonies every year for their generosity. There were visual records. I watched Earth's colonies burn. I watched a council armada, hundreds of ships flying the banners of species I'd been taught to revere, methodically annihilate a human civilization that had done nothing but exist in too much of the galaxy too quickly. I watched it happen, in clear, unfaked footage, and I understood that everything I knew about my own species' history was a story written by the people who'd tried to murder us. And there was one more thing in that vault. A name, repeated through the logs, mentioned in the final transmissions, treated with a reverence that the dying fleet reserved for one being above all others. The architect of the invasion, the council member who had argued for humanity's destruction, who had led the armada, who had given the order to burn the colonies. A being of the species called the Veil, the oldest, most respected voice on the council. A name I knew, because that same being was still alive today. 500 years later, still sitting in the highest seat of the sevenfold council, still revered across the galaxy as the wisest and most benevolent statesman of the age. Speaker Asen the Elder. The being who, 90 years ago, had personally welcomed humanity into the galactic community with open arms and tears of joy, in a ceremony broadcast to 1,000 worlds. The same being who, 500 years ago, had given the order to wipe us out. He was still there, still in his seat, and Thomas Vey had spent 400 years frozen in the dark, waiting for someone to find him, so that he could go to that seat and look that being in the eye and say the true thing out loud, in front of everyone at last. "Take me to the council," Thomas Vey said. "Take me to the hall. I've waited 400 years. I can wait a little longer, but not much. Take me there and let me speak, and I will burn down the lie they built on our bones." Getting him there was its own story, and a longer one than I have room for. Vask refused at first. She was freight, not politics, and she knew exactly how a story like this got people killed. But she watched the vault records too, all of them, and something changed in her face by the end, the way it changes when a person stops being afraid of dying and starts being afraid of not acting. "My grandmother used to say there was something wrong with the official history," she said quietly, when the last record finished playing. "Said the dates didn't line up." Said her grandmother said the same. Everybody told her she was a crank. Vask wiped her eyes hard like she was angry at them for being wet. 4 generations of us knowing something was wrong and being told we were crazy. She stood up. "We're taking him to the hall, all of us, and if they kill us for it, they kill us for it." So we did. We didn't announce it. You don't call ahead when you're carrying a 400-year-old bomb made of truth. We flew the freighter to the council homeworld under a routine cargo manifest, and we walked Thomas Vey through the great doors of the hall of the Sevenfold Council on a public petition day. The one day a year when any citizen of any member species can stand before the council and be heard. Most petitioners are farmers with land disputes, traders with grievances, small people with small problems, given their few minutes before the great powers as a gesture of galactic fairness. We took our place in the line. One old man in a borrowed coat, flanked by 6 freight workers who had no business being there, holding a data vault that was about to end the most powerful lie in the history of the galaxy. And while we waited in that line, I looked up at the high seat, at the ancient being who sat there draped in the woven light of his office, and I watched Speaker Asen the Elder preside over his council with the serene benevolence that had made him beloved across 1,000 worlds. He had no idea we were coming. He had no idea that one of the people he'd tried to erase 500 years ago had survived, frozen in the dark, carrying the proof. He had no idea that today, on an ordinary petition day, his 500-year story was going to die. I watched him, and I thought about the burning colonies in the vault, and I felt Thomas Vey's hand tighten on my arm. "There he is," Thomas Vey whispered. His voice didn't shake. After 400 years, it didn't shake at all. "Hello, old monster, I'm still here." And the line moved forward. The hall of the Sevenfold Council is the kind of place built to make you feel small. I need you to understand the scale of it, because it matters for what came after. Imagine a chamber carved into the side of a mountain, so vast that it has its own weather. Actual clouds drift near the ceiling, condensing in the cool air far above. 9,000 seats rise in tiers around a central floor, and on a session day every seat is full. Representatives and observers from every species in known space. A sea of shapes and colors and ways of being that no single mind can take in all at once. The light comes from everywhere and nowhere, soft and shadowless. The sound of 9,000 beings breathing and shifting and murmuring is like the sound of an ocean heard from inside a shell. And above it all on the high seat the seven, the ruling council. 7 beings from the 7 oldest, most powerful species, the ones who had shaped the galaxy for 10,000 years. And at their center, raised above even his peers, Speaker Asan the Elder. He was old in a way that's hard to describe. The Veil lived for thousands of years, and Asan was ancient even by their standard. His body had gone translucent and slow, draped in the ceremonial light cloth of his office, and when he spoke, his voice came soft and warm and grandfatherly through 10,000 translators at once. He had a way of making the whole vast hall feel like an intimate room. That was his gift. That was how he'd ruled for so long. He made you feel safe. I hated him before he'd said a single word to us. I'd seen what that warm, grandfatherly voice had ordered done to my ancestors. I'd watched the colonies burn. The petitions droned on. A water rights dispute between 2 mining guilds. A trade tariff appeal. Asan handled each one with gentle wisdom, and the hall murmured its approval, and I stood in the line with my heart trying to climb out of my throat, watching us get closer and closer to the floor. And then the herald called the next petition, and Tomas Vey let go of my arm and walked out alone onto the floor of the hall of the sevenfold council, a small old human in a borrowed coat under the eyes of 9,000 beings and the 7 most powerful entities in the galaxy. The herald asked his name and his species and the nature of his petition, the way they asked everyone. And Tomas Vey looked up at the high seat, straight at Asan the Elder, and his voice carried across that vast chamber clear and steady and utterly without fear. "My name is Tomas Vey," he said. "I am human, and my petition is a charge of murder against the speaker of this council." The ocean sound of 9,000 beings stopped. The hall fell completely, perfectly silent. And up on the high seat for just one instant I saw it. I was close enough. I will swear to it until I die. The serene, benevolent face of Asan the Elder went absolutely still. Not surprised, not confused. Afraid. He knew that name. After 500 years, he knew exactly what that name meant. "I see you remember me," Tomas Vey said softly into the silence. "Or not me, my fleet. The one you burned." He lifted the data vault. "I survived, Speaker. One of us survived, and I brought the truth home." I want to describe that silence, because I've never heard anything like it before or since. 9,000 beings. Every one of them had stopped. Not a murmur, not a shifting limb, not a single one of the 1,000 small sounds that a crowd that size never stops making. It was the silence of 9,000 minds all arriving at the same realization at the same instant, that something was happening here that the careful machinery of the council had never been built to handle. A charge of murder against the speaker from a human nobody had ever heard of. On the high seat, the other 6 members of the 7 were turning to look at Asan. And that, more than anything, told me Tomas Vey was right, because if the charge had been absurd, if it had been the raving of a madman, those 6 ancient beings would have looked at Tomas, at the lunatic on the floor. Instead, every one of them looked at Asan. They looked at their speaker the way you look at a person when an accusation lands and you suddenly, sickeningly, want to see their face before they have time to arrange it. Asan arranged it fast. 500 years of practice. The fear smoothed out of his translucent features and the warm grandfatherly serenity flowed back, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle and sorrowful and perfectly controlled. "My child," he said, and the translators carried it soft and kind to every corner of the hall. "You are clearly a person who has suffered something terrible. I see grief in you, old grief, deep grief. The council honors grief, but you stand in the highest chamber of galactic law, and you have leveled the gravest of charges, and you must understand that words like these carry weight. I do not know you. I have never harmed you. Tell me, what is it you believe I have done? It was masterful. I'll give the monster that. In 3 sentences he'd painted Tomas as a broken, grieving man, painted himself as a patient and wounded elder, and invited the whole hall to pity the human rather than believe him. I felt the room tilt that way. I felt 9,000 beings want to believe their beloved speaker, want this to be a sad misunderstanding they could move past. Tomas Veja smiled. A small, tired, terrible smile. You don't know me, he agreed. That's true, you never knew any of us by name, we were just targets to you, coordinates, populations to be reduced. He took a step forward. But you know what I am, speaker. You went very still when I said the word human. I watched you. You've been afraid of that word for 500 years. Humanity, Asan said smoothly, is a valued and beloved member of this council. We welcomed your people 90 years ago with 500, Tomas Vey said. The word cracked across the hall. 500 years ago, he said, not 90. That's the lie at the center of everything, and I'm going to take it apart right here in front of all of them, and there is nothing you can do to stop me because I already survived the worst thing you can do to a person. You did it 500 years ago. You killed everyone I loved. I'm not afraid of you. I am the one thing in this galaxy you cannot frighten. Asan's composure held, but I saw his light cloth flicker, a tiny involuntary thing, the veil equivalent of a flinch. Speaker, one of the other 7 said. It was a being of the Karasti, a crystalline species, its voice coming through like wind over glass. The petitioner makes a specific claim, 500 years, a different account of first contact with humanity. As a matter of order, the claim should be heard and addressed, not dismissed. The records will settle it. I could have kissed that crystalline alien. The records will settle it. It thought it was protecting Asan, thought the official history was solid, thought letting Tomas speak would expose him as a crank. It had no idea it had just opened the door that could never be closed again. Asan knew, though. I watched him calculate. I watched him understand that refusing to let Tomas speak would look like fear, would look like exactly what it was. And so he made the only move he had left. He gambled that his 500-year-old lie was buried too deep to be exhumed by one old man with a box. Of course, Asan said, spreading his translucent limbs in a gesture of openness. Let the petitioner speak. Let him show us whatever he believes he has. The truth has nothing to fear from scrutiny, and the official histories of first contact are among the most thoroughly documented records this council holds. Speak, Tomas Vey. We are listening. That was his mistake, his last one. Tomas Vey walked to the central petitioner's plinth, the raised dais where a speaker can interface their evidence with the hall's great display system, so that 9,000 beings can see what they see. He set the data vault into the receiver, and his hands, I noticed, were perfectly steady now. All the waiting was over. He'd reached the thing he'd stayed alive for. I'm going to show you, he said to the whole hall, what really happened 500 years ago. These are not my words. I'm an old man with a grievance. You'd be right not to trust my words, so I won't ask you to. These are your records, Council Fleet records, recovered from the ships you sent to destroy us. Your own logs, your own sensor data, your own transmissions in your own encoding, which I could never have faked even if I'd wanted to. Verify them yourselves. I'll wait. And he played them. The hall's great display filled the air above the central floor, vast enough for 9,000 beings to see, and the first thing that appeared was a star map. 500 years old, the dating embedded in the metadata for anyone to check. And it showed something that simply did not exist in any history book in the galaxy. It showed a human civilization. Not the frightened single planet of the official story. A network. Dozens of stars linked by trade routes marked with colony names in old Earth script. A real interstellar people, young and growing and reaching outward into the dark. Spreading faster than anything the galaxy had seen. The metadata noted with the cold precision of a military threat assessment. Human expansion rate, exponential. Projected sphere of influence in 200 years, unacceptable. I heard the hall react. A low rolling murmur, confusion, the sound of 9,000 beings seeing a piece of history that contradicted everything they'd been told. Then Thomas Vey advanced the record, and the murmur died. Because now the display showed the council fleet, the Armada. Hundreds of warships flying the banners of the great old species, banners that every being in that hall recognized, because those same species sat on the Seven today. And the records showed them gathering at the edge of human space, and they showed the order being given. The order came from a single ship, the command vessel, and the transmission was tagged with an identity code, and the hall's own systems, the council's own systems, not anything Tomas brought, translated that code and projected the name above the Armada in letters 10 meters tall, for 9,000 beings to read. Fleet Commander, OSSUN of the VEHL. The hall made a sound I can't describe. A vast intake of breath, a recoil, the sound of an ocean pulling back from a shore before a wave. And then Thomas Vey played the worst part. He played the burning. I'd seen it already in the vault, and it had nearly broken me. Watching it again, on that scale in front of that crowd, I had to look at the floor. I couldn't watch the colonies die a second time. But I watched the hall watch it. I watched 9,000 beings see a human civilization annihilated. Watched them see the Council Armada move from world to world, methodical, patient, thorough. Watched them see the human fleet, outnumbered, outgunned, but fighting God they fought, try to defend their homes and fail and die. Watched the colonies go dark one after another. Watched a people get erased. And through all of it, in the transmissions, calm and unhurried, the voice of the fleet commander giving orders. 500 years younger but unmistakable. The same voice that had welcomed humanity with tears 90 years ago. The same voice that, minutes earlier, had called Thomas Vey my child in tones of grandfatherly love. Reduce the third colony. Leave no orbital infrastructure. We cannot allow them to rebuild. The capital world is requesting terms of surrender. Denied. Proceed with sterilization. Yes, all of them. This is not cruelty. This is necessary. In 1,000 years they would have swallowed the galaxy. We are doing what must be done. History will not record this, and that is a mercy we grant ourselves. History will not record this. That line hung in the air of the hall like a blade. The speaker had said it himself, 500 years ago, with his own voice. History will not record this. And he'd been right, he'd made sure of it. He'd burned a civilization, waited for the survivors to forget, and then rewritten himself as their savior. But one record had survived, frozen in the dark, waiting 400 years for a human ship. The recording ended, the display went dark, and the hall of the Sevenfold Council sat in a silence so total it had weight. Thomas Vey turned slowly to face the high seat. You said history would not record it, he said. His voice was very quiet, but the hall was so silent it carried to every seat. You were almost right. You burned 100 worlds and waited for the ashes to forget their own names. And then you found the broken remnant you'd made of us, 300 years later, huddled on one planet with no memory of what we'd been, and you welcomed us. You wept. You gave a beautiful speech about lifting up the lonely young species, and every word of it was a lie told over the grave of the people you murdered to make that lonely young species exist. He took a breath. You didn't just kill us, Speaker. That would have been a mercy compared to what you did. You killed us, and then you stole our history, and then you made us thank you for it. For 90 years we have been holding ceremonies to honor the being who tried to exterminate us. We named institutions after you. Children learn your name as a hero's name. You took our dead and our past and our gratitude, all three. His voice finally cracked, not with fear, but with 500 years of grief finally reaching open air. My wife was on the second colony, my daughter. I went into cryo on a defense run and I came out into a graveyard and I have spent 400 years frozen in the dark with their faces, waiting for the chance to make you say it out loud. So say it. In front of all of them. Say what you did." Asan the elder said nothing. The whole hall had turned to him. 9,000 beings. The other 6 of the 7, drawn away from him in their seats now, a physical gap opening around the speaker as though the truth were something they could catch. And Asan sat in his high seat, draped in the woven light of an office he'd held for longer than humanity had memory, and he looked down at the small old human on the floor. And for a long moment, the most powerful being in the galaxy could not find a single word. Then he found one, and it was the wrong one, and I think he knew it the instant it left him. But 500 years of certainty doesn't die quietly. "You would have destroyed everything," Asan said. The hall flinched as one body, because that wasn't a denial, that was a justification. He'd had 100 avenues: call the records forged, call Tomas mad, call for recess, deny, deflect, lie the way he'd lied for 5 centuries. And instead, faced with the burning worlds and his own voice giving the orders, the oldest and wisest statesman in the galaxy had reached past all of it and simply said, "I did it, and I was right too." "You don't understand what you were," Asan said, and now his voice was rising, the grandfatherly warmth burning off it like morning fog, and underneath was something I'd never heard from him, something hard and old and absolutely certain. "None of you understand. I have watched 10,000 years of this galaxy. I have seen species rise and fall. And in all that time I never saw anything like humanity. Your expansion rate, your adaptability, your speed. In 500 years, you went from a single world to 100. Show me another species that has ever done that. You cannot, because there is no other. You were not a people. You were a wildfire. And I have spent my long life keeping this galaxy from burning." He leaned forward in the high seat, and the light cloth of his office blazed. "Yes, I gave the order. I burned your worlds and I broke your fleet and I cast your survivors back into the dark to begin again as something small and slow and manageable. And then I watched you for 300 years to be certain, and when you came back chastened, frightened, contained, I welcomed you, because a humanity that's small and grateful is an asset to this galaxy, and a humanity left to grow unchecked is the end of it." His ancient gaze swept the hall. "Every one of you has lived in peace and safety for 500 years because of what I did. You are alive because I was willing to do the terrible thing that no one else would do. I regret the deaths. I have never once regretted the decision. Judge me if you must, but understand that I would do it again." The silence after that was different. It wasn't shock anymore. It was the silence of 9,000 beings doing terrible arithmetic, weighing 100 murdered worlds against 500 years of their own peace, and hating that the weighing was happening at all. And I understood in that moment that Asan might win this. That he was old and clever and he'd just reframed genocide as guardianship. And that there were beings in that hall who would grab that reframing like a drowning thing grabs a rope. Because the alternative was admitting that their entire civilization's peace was built on a mass grave they'd been thanking the gravedigger for. It was Tomas Vey who'd brought the truth, but it wasn't Tomas Vey who broke Asan. It was Renner, it was me, because I couldn't stay silent. I don't remember deciding to walk onto the floor. I just found myself there, out past the petitioner's line, standing next to Tomas with 9,000 beings staring at me, and my voice came out shaking, but it came out loud. "That's the lie, though," I said. "That's the lie underneath the lie. You said we were a wildfire. You said we'd have swallowed the galaxy." I was breathing hard. I'm not a speaker. I'm a cargo medic. But I'd watched those colonies burn, and something in me had simply refused to let his version be the last word. "You want to know what humanity actually did, Speaker, when we got our second chance, when you so generously let us live? You let us back into the galaxy 90 years ago expecting a wildfire, and we joined your council and we kept your laws, and in 90 years we never invaded anyone. never sterilized a world, never burned a colony, never gave an order like the ones in those recordings. The hall was listening. I felt it. I pushed on. You looked at a young species spreading fast, and you saw a threat that had to be exterminated. But you never once asked us. You never tried talking. You never tried treaties or borders or any of the 10,000 things this council does every single day to keep the peace between species. You skipped straight to genocide because it was easier, and then you spent 500 years calling it wisdom. I pointed up at him, and my hand was shaking, and I didn't care. We had our second chance to show you what we really are, and we didn't burn anything. You're the one who burns worlds. You did it 500 years ago, and you just stood up in front of all of them and promised you'd do it again. So tell me, Speaker, between the species that was given power and chose peace, and the species that was given power and chose extermination, which one of us is actually the wildfire? The hall erupted. It wasn't applause. It was bigger and uglier and more important than applause. It was 9,000 beings finding their voices at once, and the thing in those voices was not pity for Asan anymore, and it was not the cold arithmetic of weighing peace against murder. It was the sound of a realization tearing through a crowd, that the being they'd revered for 10,000 years had just confessed to genocide and defended it, that the species they'd been taught to pity had, when handed the same power, refused to do the same evil. The other 6 of the 7 were on their feet, or whatever passed for it in their varied bodies. The crystalline Karesti, the one who'd insisted the records be heard, turned to Asan, and its wind-over glass voice cut through the chaos. You gave the order, it said. It wasn't a question. It is not forgery. The codes are ours. The voice is yours. You stood before this council 1,000 times and you never spoke of it. You let us build monuments to your mercy. The crystalline being's light went sharp and cold. Speaker Asan, you will answer for this, not as a matter of grief, as a matter of law. And Asan the elder, 500 years a liar, 10,000 years a power, looked out at the hall turning against him, at the gap widening around his high seat, at 6 of the 7 drawing away, at 9,000 beings who would never again hear his warm grandfatherly voice without hearing underneath it the orders to sterilize a world. And the certainty finally went out of him. Not into fear, into something worse. Into the terrible blankness of a being who has just understood that the story he told himself for 5 centuries, the story where he was the galaxy's necessary guardian, the wise hand that did the hard thing, that story was over. And without it, he was just what Thomas Vey had named him in the first 30 seconds. A murderer, the largest in the history of the galaxy, finally, after 500 years, standing in the light. He sank back into the high seat, his light cloth dimmed, and the most powerful being any of us had ever known became, in front of 9,000 witnesses, just a very old creature who had done a terrible thing and run out of places to hide it. Thomas Vey watched him fall apart, and there was no triumph in the old man's face, none at all. Just a deep and bottomless exhaustion, the look of someone who has finally set down a weight he's carried for 400 years, and found that setting it down doesn't bring back any of the people it was carried for. There, Thomas Vey said quietly into the roar of the hall, now they know, now everyone knows. His voice dropped just for himself, just for me, barely a whisper. Did you see them, Aless? Did you see? I told them. I finally told them what he did to you. Aless, his wife, I'd learn later, 500 years dead on the 2nd colony. He'd been talking to her the whole time. They didn't arrest Asan that day. I think people expect that part, the dramatic moment where guards come and take the monster away in chains. It didn't happen like that. It was both smaller and stranger than that. What happened was that the hall couldn't hold a session anymore. It just couldn't. 9,000 beings had watched their galaxy's foundational story turn to ash in the space of an hour, and there was no procedure for that, no precedent, no rule that told the council what to do when its own speaker confessed to genocide from the high seat. The crystalline Karasti called for an emergency suspension. The other members of the seven agreed in a daze, and the session simply dissolved. 9,000 beings filed out of the hall in a silence almost as deep as the one that had fallen when Tomas first spoke, except this silence had something broken in it. I remember standing on the floor as they left, watching the tiers empty, watching beings of 100 species pass us on their way out, and almost none of them would meet our eyes, not out of contempt, I understood later, but out of shame. They'd looked at us with pity for 90 years. They didn't know how to look at us now. Asan the Elder was the last to leave the high seat. His aides, veil attendants who'd served him for centuries, approached him uncertainly, and for a moment he didn't move at all. Then he rose, slow, ancient, his light cloth dimmed to almost nothing, and he descended from the seat he'd held for 10,000 years. He had to pass close to us to reach the side exit, and he stopped, right in front of Tomas V. The two of them looked at each other, the man who'd ordered the murder and the man who'd survived it. 500 years between them, and about a meter of empty air. "You've destroyed me," Asan said, quietly, not angry, almost wondering. 5 centuries of work, the piece I built, all of it, one frozen man in a box. "I didn't destroy anything," Tomas V said. "I just stopped you from hiding it. There's a difference. You destroyed it 500 years ago when you gave the order. The lie was always going to fall. It just had to wait for someone who'd kept the truth." He looked up at the towering ancient being without a flicker of fear. "You should have killed all of us, Speaker. That was your mistake. You burned 100 worlds, but you didn't check the cryo bays. You left one of us asleep in the dark. And one was enough." Asan looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally, "one was enough." And something moved across his ancient translucent face, not remorse. I don't think he was capable of remorse, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The recognition a thing gives the thing that finally beat it. I told myself I felt nothing for 500 years, that it was arithmetic, that it was necessary, that a leader does the terrible thing and feels nothing. His light flickered. I find at the end that I was lying about that too. I just didn't know it until I had to watch your worlds burn again, in front of all of them, through your eyes instead of mine. He moved toward the exit, then paused one last time. "For what it's worth," Asan the Elder said, "your people were never the wildfire. I knew that even then. That was what frightened me. A wildfire you can understand. A wildfire only consumes." He didn't look back. "But you grew, and you never once burned anything that wasn't trying to burn you first. I had no category for that. So I made you into a fire in my mind because a fire I knew how to put out. I have spent 500 years afraid of a thing that was never coming, and I murdered 100 worlds to prevent it." His voice was very soft. "That is the truth I'll take with me. It is a worse one than anyone in that hall imagined." And then he was gone, through the side door, an old creature walking into the ruin of his own legend, and I never saw him again. The trials took years. I won't pretend I followed all of it. Most of it happened in chambers far above the pay grade of a cargo medic, and Vask got us all back on the freighter and back to work within a few months, because debts don't pause for galactic history. But I followed the big moments. Everyone did. The records Tomas brought were verified exhaustively by every species with a stake in disputing them. They held. They held because they were real, and because they were the Council's own data, and because in the end the truth has a kind of weight that no amount of power can fake. The galaxy's foundational story, the benevolent Council lifting up the lonely young humans, collapsed completely. What replaced it was uglier and truer. Humanity had been a starfaring people 500 years ago. The Council, terrified of how fast we were growing, had exterminated us, burned our colonies, shattered our fleet, and bombed the survivors back to a single planet and a few thousand years of lost memory. Then they'd waited for us to forget, and when we crawled back into space, they'd written themselves the role of saviors and us the role of the rescued, and we'd believed it because the only people who could have contradicted it were dead. all except one, frozen in the dark, waiting. Asan was the architect, but he wasn't the only one. The records named others, fleet commanders, council members, whole species governments that had voted for the extermination. Some of them were still alive, in the long-lived species. Some of their descendants held power now. The reckoning spread outward in widening rings, and it was messy, and it was incomplete, and a lot of the guilty found ways to muddy their part in it. That's how these things go. The truth comes out, but justice only ever comes out partway. But some things did change, and they changed permanently. The monuments to Asan came down, every one of them on every world. The ceremonies humanity had held for 90 years, thanking the Council for its mercy, those stopped, and in their place slowly came something new. Days of remembrance for the 100 worlds. The galaxy had to learn the names of the colonies it had pretended never existed. Tomas Vey gave them those names. He'd carried them too all that time. Alessa's colony, his daughter's school. All 100 of them, every name he could recover from the records, read into the permanent archive of the Council so that this time history would record it. And humanity's seat at the Council changed. We'd sat there 90 years as the rescued, the grateful junior partner, the species that owed everything to the great old powers. After the truth came out, we sat there as something else. Not as the wildfire Asan had feared. As something he'd never had a category for, the species that had been given every reason to burn the galaxy down in revenge, and had chosen instead to ask only that the truth be told and the dead be named. I think that frightened the old powers more than any fleet could have. A vengeful humanity they'd have understood. A humanity that wanted reparations, territory, blood, that fit the shape of the universe they knew. But a humanity that stood over the proof of its own genocide and asked only for remembrance. That was the thing Asan had glimpsed 500 years ago and never understood. A people who grew without burning. There's no defending against that, because there's nothing to defend against. There's only the slow, uncomfortable work of learning to deserve to share a galaxy with them. Tomas Vey didn't live to see most of it. 400 years in a failing cryopod takes a toll no thawing can fully undo. The doctors, real doctors, on a real council medical world, the best in the galaxy, they did everything. But the damage was too deep and too old. He'd kept himself alive on willpower and unfinished business. And once the business was finished, once the truth was told and the names were read into the record, the willpower had nothing left to hold up. I went to see him at the end. I'd kept in touch. You don't share something like that with a person and then just drift apart. He was in a quiet room on a green world, the kind of world humanity wasn't allowed to dream of when he was young, and there was a window with real trees outside it, and he was looking at them when I came in. "Renner," he said, and he smiled. He was so thin by then, so light, like the 400 years had finally caught up all at once. "They told me you were coming. Sit. Tell me something true." I sat. I didn't know what to say, so I said the truest thing I had. They read the last of the names yesterday, all 100 colonies. It's in the permanent archive now. Alessa's colony was the 81st. They read her colony's name out loud in the hall, and 9,000 beings stood for it. Tomas Vey closed his eyes, and the breath that went out of him then was the longest, slowest, most complete exhale I have ever heard from a living person. 400 years of held breath, finally let go. "Then it's done," he whispered. "Then I can stop." "You did it," I told him. "You did the impossible thing. You came out of a graveyard 400 years late, and you brought down the most powerful liar in the galaxy with a box of old records and the truth. Nobody will ever forget what you did." He shook his head slow against the pillow. "That's not Renner, that was never the point. I didn't do it to be remembered. I did it so they would be." His hand found mine, and there was almost no strength left in it. 100 worlds, 40 billion people. They tried to erase them so completely that even the survivors thanked them for it. I couldn't bring anyone back. I knew that the day I woke up in the graveyard. The only thing I could do, the only thing was make sure the galaxy had to say their names. His eyes opened, gray and ancient and finally at peace. And now it has to. Forever. That's enough. That was always the only thing that could ever be enough. He looked back at the trees outside the window. I get to stop now, he said again softly, like he couldn't quite believe it was allowed. I've been so tired for so long, 400 years, and I get to put it down and go to her. A small smile. Do you think she'll be angry I took so long? No, I said. My voice wasn't working right. I think she'll understand you stayed to tell her story. Yes, Tomas V breathed. Yes, I think she will. He died that night, looking at the trees. The last survivor of a murdered civilization, the man who'd waited 400 years in the dark to make a galaxy say the names of its dead. They wanted to give him a state funeral. The whole council did, every species, the grandest honors in galactic history. His will asked for none of it. He asked to be buried on a green world under real trees with one marker, and on the marker, no titles. No mention of the trial or the records or the speaker he'd brought down. Just his name and the name of his wife and the name of his daughter and one line underneath. They were here, they were not forgotten. I'm an old man myself now telling you this. Older than Tomas was when we pulled him out of that pod if you don't count the centuries he spent frozen. I went back to freight work for a while after. Then I found I couldn't somehow. Once you've stood on the floor of the Sevenfold Council and watched a 500-year lie die, refilling coffee dispensers loses its appeal. So I started telling the story instead. To anyone who'd listen. To you now. People ask me what the lesson is. They always want a lesson, like the story isn't enough on its own. And for a long time I didn't have one, or I had too many and couldn't choose. But I've had a lot of years to think, and I think I finally know what I'd say. Everyone remembers the big moment, the hall falling silent, the records playing, Asun confessing, the species that was given power and chose peace. That's the part that ends up in the histories, and it matters, all of it matters. But the part I think about, the part that keeps me up some nights, is the smallest part. It's a man in a failing cryopod, 80 years before any of the rest of it, waking up alone in a graveyard 100,000 kilometers wide, understanding that everyone he loved was 400 years dead, and that the people who killed them had gotten away with it so completely that history itself had forgotten the crime. And in that moment, alone, grieving, with every reason in the universe to simply open the pod and let the cold take him, Tomas V made a choice. He chose to go back to sleep, to wait, to keep the truth alive on the chance, the tiny impossible chance, that someday a ship would come and someone would listen, and the names of the dead might be spoken again. That's the part, not the power, not the fleets or the council or the great reckoning. One grieving man choosing to carry the truth a little farther through the dark, on nothing but the hope that it might someday matter. The galaxy thinks humanity's strength is that we grow fast, or that we don't break, or that we chose mercy when we could have chosen fire. And maybe those things are true, but I was there, and I'll tell you what I saw. I saw that our real strength is simpler and stranger than any of that. We don't let go of our dead, we carry them. Through graveyards and centuries and the long, cold dark, we carry them, and we keep their names, and we wait however long we have to wait for the chance to say they were here. And we do not stop, and we do not forget, and in the end that turns out to be the one thing in all the universe that no amount of power can ever burn away. Asun the Elder spent 500 years and 100 murdered worlds trying to erase one species from history. He was beaten by a single man who refused to let 3 people be forgotten. That's the whole story. That's the only lesson I have. Carry your dead, keep their names, and never ever let anyone tell you that the small grieving choice to hold onto the truth in the dark doesn't matter. It's the only thing that ever has.